Hey, folks. Good morning, good evening, good middle of the night, whenever the heck you're watching this. It's Ben Freeman here again, and going to talk some defense budgets. I'm coming to you from the Sunshine State, where if anybody's ever been here, you might know about our famous thunderstorms when it's not sunny at all. And we are in the midst of one right now, so apologize if Mother Nature makes her voice heard during the presentation. But what we're going to talk about, we're just going to spend 15 minutes or so talking about debt and deficits. We already had a good conversation with you talking about the defense budget process. Hope everybody had a chance to go through that video. That's really the core basis for everything we're going to talk about here. But the debt and deficits, it's a really important component of that, and I particularly think it will be going forward. And so we're going to take a look here at my Prezi and see if I can get it presented here. And just as we were doing before, we're going to try to do this in a little bit of a MythBusters type fashion. And first, we're going to talk about debt and deficits, who's to blame, who owns the debt, and finally, is it going to get better? You can see some of the numbers we've got down there. Don't look at those too close yet. We will definitely get there. So first of all, let's talk about deficits and debt. You probably heard these two terms, and you probably even heard them used interchangeably. Well, for better or for worse, they are not interchangeable. A budget deficit, you can think of that as an annual thing. So whenever a government runs a budget deficit, whenever revenues do not exceed expenses for a government. And this has been the case now for the U.S. for the last 20 years. We actually haven't had a budget surplus since the fiscal year of 2020. And so when we're talking budget deficits, that's what we're talking about on this annual basis. The national debt is effectively the collective accumulation of all those deficits, plus any interest that we might have added to those on top of that. It's the national debt is what we collectively owe there. And if you look on the screen there, that's that a giant nasty number, $26.5 trillion. Then that's there in the debt clock. That's the national debt. Now, next bullet point: who is to blame for all this? Now, if we were doing this in a sync session, I would probably put this up as a thought board, let you guys chime in with your own thoughts on who's to blame for this. Is it is it the Democrats or is it the Republicans? Because really, debt and deficits are used as a political football, frankly. Republicans will say, "Oh, those Democrats, they're spending too much on stuff," and the Democrats will say, "Those Republicans, they're cutting taxes too much, so we're not getting enough of that revenue coming in." So regardless of who you're talking to, then they'll say it's somebody's fault. I have good news and bad news for you. It's everybody's fault. And it frankly is both parties' fault, fairly equally, I would say. It doesn't really matter if you look at this chart here. It doesn't really matter if we've been under a Democratic president, Republican president, Democratic House, Republican House, Democratic Senate, Republican House. It really doesn't matter. And we played with all those different combinations. And the one common thread we've seen over the last 40 years is that the deficits keep increasing and the national debt just keeps going up and up and up. And this trend would continue to into the Trump administration, where the debt has continued to grow as well. And you can notice that there's a pretty clear pattern across all these administrations. Another thing I'd like you to take a look at here is this green line here. And if you look at the legend up there, you'll see that is what we call the debt ceiling. And you might have heard this term before. And another way to think of it is it's effectively like the government's credit limit. How much credit can they take on? We've all got our credit cards, and we have an upper limit for what those credit what we can put on those credit cards. But the federal government, much like us, they have the opportunity to say, you know what, I'm getting close to that credit limit. I might want a credit limit increase. Maybe we should increase that the level of credit that we've got out there. That in this case for the federal government, that is the debt ceiling. The interesting thing for the federal government is that unlike you or I, who has to ask somebody externally, credit card company, that sort of thing, for a credit limit increase, the federal government really just has to ask themselves. Congress can authorize an increase in the debt ceiling, and effectively, for the longest time, these debt ceiling increases were effectively automatic. And it wasn't even a thought for most members of Congress. And that's really until we get to around 2010 here. And some folks might remember the Tea Party, tax enough already. And this was really the first political movement we've seen in decades that was really concerned about debt and deficits. And so they said, enough, tax enough already, as the name would indicate. Enough with this debt ceiling going up. We're actually going to hold this hostage a little bit. We're not going to just automatically, say that the debt ceiling can go up now. This had a lot of repercussions. Ultimately leads to things like the Budget Control Act, sequestration, and a lot of other, near shutdown or actual shutdown issues, and a lot of other things. But as you'll notice, after 2010, what happens to the debt and deficits? They just start going right back up again. That movement really lost momentum, and really became the consensus to just keep that deficit spending going and keep adding to that debt. Now, this is the question: who owns the debt? This is a very big question, and folks have a lot of ideas about who owns our debt, and one of the biggest ones you'll probably hear is that China owns our debt. And they are a large holder, but there's somebody who's much bigger than them. Any guesses? Think about it. For those of you at home who said we are, you are correct. You are absolutely correct. The largest holders of the U.S. national debt are actually U.S. investors. We have a plurality. U.S. investors have a plurality of U.S. national debt. And by the way, with all these figures, we don't have this up to date yet on who owns what with the current surge in debt that we've had this year. Hopefully next time we see out of Log 21, we'll have those updated figures for you. So these are from last summer. What we see here is that U.S. investors they're number one. And if you include other folks in the U.S. too, this gets to be an even bigger share. The Federal Reserve, the U.S. Federal Reserve, part of the federal government, they've got another 2.38 trillion, and the U.S. government itself. And this is going to include everything from pension programs, Social Security programs. That's another 5.73 trillion dollars. And so effectively between these U.S. investors and the U.S. government, really, if you have a retirement plan or any sort of pension plan, chances are you yourself are one of the owners of U.S. debt. But what we do have here, this bottom category, we do have a sizable chunk of U.S. debt that is owned by those foreign investors. Over $6 trillion of it currently owned by foreign investors. If we look at the breakdown of that, you'll see, for those of you that did say China being the biggest debt holder, you are right in the sense that they are the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt. Once you take away, all those, pension accounts, all those U.S. investors, those U.S. government accounts, Social Security, that sort of thing. After all those folks, when we're talking foreign investors, China is number one. They do go back and forth a little bit with Japan. Historically, Japan and China have been sort of far and away number one and number two. And some other countries in here: Brazil, Ireland, UK, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, and Hong Kong too. I mean, we might, especially these days, we might, for better or for worse, have to lump Hong Kong in with China there. But I do want to point out here that while folks talk about the amount of U.S. national debt that's held by China, it really is a small percentage overall. We're not even talking 6% here. We're talking a little over 5% of that. So really, the idea if China tried to cash in their debt overnight or stop buying future debt, that this would in some ways bring the U.S. economy to a screeching halt. I don't think there's a lot of merit to that, and because as you can see from this and from the previous chart, there's plenty of folks who are still interested in buying up that U.S. debt. And one of the principal reasons for that is that we've really been a reliable payer on that debt. And, the U.S. debt is considered one of the safest investments you can make. Not a really high return, but it's pretty much it's effectively, at least historically, it's been a guaranteed return. We haven't defaulted on the debt yet. So that's why, I don't see the issue of China, not buying future debt as being a big of a threat as others might. So let's cut to the brass tacks now. Is it going to get better? This is probably what you've been wondering about. I never claim to be the optimist when it comes to budget presentations, and I'm certainly not going to be right here, unfortunately. The short answer on is it going to get better is that absolutely not. This is a great chart, I think, from our friends at the Peterson Foundation who do a good job of tracking the national debt. And this tracks on, on one hand, we've got the percentage of the debt held by the public here as a percentage of GDP. And, over here we have, what that percentage is over time. And I think there's some important frames of reference here. When you think back to World War II, we had those war bonds. We had everybody really dug in to cover that national debt. To put that in perspective, we're about to be there in just a few years. We will be at that level of debt where the public portion of that debt, the non-U.S. government held portion of that debt, does exceed the GDP, the gross domestic product, or the entire economy of the U.S. And after that, it's only going to get even worse. If we follow this trend, this is an alternative scenario where we keep a lot of tax cuts we've already got in place, and some other things keep going forward. And I'm going to throw some even more water on the fire here too. More bad news for you. This chart was actually out before everything that's happened with debt and deficits this year, and this gives you a sense of how crazy it has already been this year in terms of the bailouts that we've had for COVID relief and economic effects this year. We've run some pretty significant debts in the past, and you can see here for perspective, 2008, 2009, we run a rather large deficit in that year. And when you think back to that time, we've got a couple of things going on that are really important. We have the bailouts from the financial crisis. That was a big hit to the deficits. But we also have the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's really the height of the wars there. And so we were spending a lot of money on those wars too. Those two events combined, and we do get this really big budget deficits there. But now compare that, that previous that was the highest in the 21st century. Where we're at this year is already a third of that. And there's a possibility that we could have even more coming through if there are more COVID stimulus payments and more economic relief too. We could certainly, agree or disagree about whether we should have those things. But the one thing we can most certainly do know is that this is going to contribute significantly to the U.S. National debt, and it's really going to change the picture of a lot of our calculations over time about the composition of the overall budget. And one of the reasons is too, if you look going forward over the next 10 years, this sort of has something of a lingering effect in that it's going to carry forward into future years. And the prediction here is that by 2030 we'll have an annual budget deficit of $2.6 trillion. And why is that significant? Why do I bring this up when we're talking about the defense budget process? Because really what we're seeing happen here more and more is that there is a growing squeeze on the federal government's budget from the interest payments that we're having to make on this debt. And this chart tracks it for a 20-year period, and you can see us kind of right there in the middle. And also I have bad news again. This chart was before everything that happened this year, so this chart is actually even worse. But what you can see from this chart is that we're hovering right now at a little over $300 billion in net interest payments that we have to make every year to keep our debt financed. so we don't have those defaults. That is going to increase rapidly going forward over the next 10 years, to the point, if you look out here to 2029, we're looking at a time period when those debt service payments could be in the 800 to 900 billion dollar range. And that's critically important because, as you know from watching the first async video on the defense budget, that's more than the defense budget. And we're actually going to hit an inflection point, somewhere around here, 2024, 2025, where the service payments that we are making on the national debt are actually more than the entire defense budget. In other words, another way to think of that then is, if we didn't have to make these debt service payments, then we could literally double the defense budget for the same price. And so what a lot of folks have begun to be concerned about is that these incredibly high debt service payments, they're going to lead to squeezing in other parts of the budget. And that can include putting downward pressure on the DoD budget. And we're already hearing a lot about that this year when it comes to the National Defense Authorization Act process and the defense appropriations process. A lot of legislators that are saying the DoD budget should be cut to help pay for some of these COVID relief programs. So again, I bring this up just so you're well aware of it, and as a sort of indicator of some of the future pressures that we might see on the defense budget going forward. In case that wasn't depressing enough, I would like to introduce you to the usdebtclock.org. This is it's a great site. I think it's a great site, but y'all know me, I'm just a defense budget nerd. But I really like this site because it actually gives you running tallies of a lot of different economic figures, most notably the debt. So you can check it out, usdebtclock.org. They also have a wonderful app on your phone. It's only a couple bucks, but in case you're wondering about these numbers offhand, like I am, you can grab that too. But the website works just as well. And right off the bat, you can see some really key figures here for us. And the U.S. national debt being now over $26 trillion. You can get a sense of kind of where we're going this year, and where we're at in the process of spending this year. As you can see, the mismatch right now between our federal spending and our federal tax revenue right here, they're pretty extraordinary already so far this year. And for better or for worse, we're already through tax season this year. So there's not a lot of additional federal tax revenue that's going to come in, but there is a lot of federal spending that's going to keep going too. So that's going to keep driving this red wedge, and that's going to probably get us closer to that, the $4.2 trillion figure we mentioned before about the projected budget deficit this year. So this 3.7 is probably going to get much closer to that 4.2 by the end of the year. But you can check out other stuff here too. They've got good information on state debt. Don't worry, the states are all in debt too. Local debts in here, the debt per citizen. If you want to figure out, up here for the national debt, like what you'd have to pay it off, it's a good chunk of money, guys. And you can look at the budget items too. Try to see, what are the biggest drivers: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, then Defense War. That includes the Pentagon budget there. And then, of course, the interest on the debt, like we were talking about too. And you sort of get a sense by looking at all these numbers, why that interest on the debt increasing is going to lead to a squeeze in some of these other categories of spending too. There's a lot to process here, and I realize that. So I encourage you guys actually you can even pause the video right now to take a harder look at this, or go to usdebtclock.org. Take a harder look at all this stuff. You can even go back and look through some of the charts that we had in here too. There's a whole lot to process here, but I think it's really important to understand what's going on here, to understand what some of the current pressures on the DoD budget are from debt and deficits, and how the future debt and deficit scenario might lead to even greater pressure on the defense budget. And of course, when we talk in person, I know you're going to have a lot of questions about this. I can't wait for it. So I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about all that. And it's going to be a lively conversation. We're going to get out our crystal ball and talk about some more of the issues that are going on in the defense budget this very year. So very much look forward to meeting you all in person, and hope you have a wonderful day.